It was still dark when the first whispers reached the Quai des Orfèvres. Paris was shrouded in the kind of winter fog that blurred the gas lamps into trembling halos and left the cobblestones slick beneath the boots of milkmen and workmen beginning their day. Somewhere across the river, a woman's body had been found in an empty square, her lips curved into a faint, uncanny smile. By the time the telegram reached Maigret, smoke was already curling from the chimney of his pipe, his heavy frame settled in the worn chair behind his desk. Nothing in the short, efficient note conveyed the strangeness of that smile. It was not irony, not fear, not resignation. It was the kind of smile one might give to an old acquaintance. And yet the woman was alone, and she was dead. If you find yourself drawn into these shadows, into the way a single night in Paris can unfold into a labyrinth of lives and lies, I invite you to linger with us. Stay with Maigret as he treads the damp alleys, listens at the smoky cafes, and waits in silence for truth to reveal itself. If this world speaks to you, I encourage you, quietly, naturally, to like this story, share it with those who follow mysteries, and subscribe so that you may walk again beside the inspector through the fog. The city was still muffled in sleep when the square revealed its secret. It was not a grand place, merely a neglected corner near the river where the cobblestones sagged unevenly and the iron railings of a fountain stood rusted by years of rain. The fog pressed low, dense as wool, curling in the hollows of the streets so that gas lamps burned with a jaundiced glow, their halos trembling in the damp. It was in this obscurity that the constable first found her at a little past 5 o'clock, lying as though she had chosen her position. Her head rested gently against the cold stone of the fountain's base, one arm trailing, her skirt pulled modestly around her knees. Nothing of violence marked her except for the stillness of her breathing chest, which no longer rose, and the faint, unmistakable curve at her lips. The square smelled of wet leaves and soot. Somewhere in the distance a carriage passed, wheels striking rhythmically against cobblestones. But here, at the very heart of this forgotten enclave, there was only silence and the body. The constable, nervous, had sent for the commissariat at once, and by the time Maigret arrived, the morning was no further along. Dawn had not yet claimed the sky. His heavy coat was beaded with moisture as he stepped down from the car, pipe stem clamped between his teeth, his broad features impassive but watchful. He moved without hurry. That was his way, absorbing atmosphere before absorbing facts. The square impressed itself on him, its loneliness, its corners, the faint echo of shoes striking stone. He noticed the shutters of the houses around the fountain were closed. No one had opened them to peer down, not yet. Windows glistened with condensation. The silence was not only physical, it was the silence of neighbors reluctant to be involved. The lamplight touched her face unevenly. She was neither young nor old, somewhere in her late 30s perhaps, the kind of age where life's choices already left their mark, but had not yet carved them deep. Her coat was plain, brown wool, worn at the cuffs. Her shoes were good, not luxurious, but maintained. A handbag lay beside her, clasped closed, unforced. There was no sign of robbery, no scattered contents. Yet it was the smile that held him. A faint, nearly imperceptible smile, not a grin, not the grotesque contortion of pain mistaken for mirth. Something smaller, more private. As if she had seen something at the end that no one else had seen, and had taken it with her. Janvier stood nearby, shoulders hunched, his collar turned up against the fog. He had been among the first to arrive, called from his home in haste, his breath still carrying the smell of hurried coffee. "Nothing's been touched, Chief," he muttered, nodding toward the woman. No witnesses yet. Constable heard nothing until he saw her. Maigret crouched, his knees creaking, the fog dampening the wool of his trousers. He examined the hem of her skirt, the gloves tucked carefully in her coat pocket, the faint impression of perfume lingering about her collar. It was not the bright, cheap perfume of Montmartre, but neither was it extravagant, something floral, modest, like violets pressed between pages. He leaned closer, and in that quiet, with his pipe smoke curling faintly from his lips, he whispered, not for Janvier, not for anyone, but to himself. She knew. The body would be taken to the morgue soon enough, but for now it was part of the square, and the square was part of her. He raised his eyes slowly, taking in the geometry of the place. The alleys that fed into it, narrow and crooked. The shuttered bakery at the corner. The single street lamp flickering faintly, buzzing with the wet. He imagined her steps, alone, perhaps unhurried, the sound of her shoes muffled in fog. What had brought her here at such an hour? And why had she stopped at the fountain to rest her head against it, as though in resignation? A cat darted suddenly across the square, tail flashing, claws clicking on stone. Janvier, startled faintly, muttered an oath, then fell back into silence. Maigret only straightened, puffed his pipe once more, and allowed the scene to sink into him. He knew from long habit that answers rarely lay in the noise of questions, but in the quiet persistence of place. The city itself spoke, if one gave it time. Soon the cart from the morgue arrived, its wheels creaking, the horse blowing mist from its nostrils. Two men in rough coats descended, professional in their detachment. They bent to lift her gently as though carrying furniture rather than a body. For a moment, the smile wavered in the lamplight, seeming almost to widen, before it was obscured by the sheet drawn across her face. And in that moment, Maigret felt the first tug of unease that told him this case would not be simple. He remained after they left, standing in the middle of the square with Janvier beside him. "You think it was natural?" Janvier asked, voice low, unwilling to pierce the fog. Maigret did not answer at once. He puffed at his pipe, watching the smoke dissolve into mist. "No," he said finally. "Not natural." The square emptied slowly, leaving only the damp stones, the trickle of water from the fountain, the lingering impression of a woman who had smiled at her own end. Maigret's boots echoed heavily as he turned, heading back toward the car. Already the city was beginning to stir. Milk carts rattled along the boulevards, shutters creaked open, voices began to rise. But for him, the day had already begun, and it carried with it the weight of that strange, private smile. At Quai des Orfèvres, the routine would unfold, papers to be signed, reports to be filed, men waiting for orders. But as he walked, Maigret's thoughts were not with bureaucracy. They were with the image of a woman in fog who had seemed almost to greet her murderer, or death itself, with a knowing curve of the lips. He could not yet explain it, but he felt in his chest the heavy certainty that whatever truth lay behind that smile would not come easily. It would have to be coaxed, step by step, through alleys, through cafes, through conversations that revealed nothing yet suggested everything. The Seine rolled dark and sluggish as he crossed it, barges looming like shadows on the water. He paused a moment, leaning against the bridge railing, pipe in hand, eyes fixed on the faint ripples catching the glow of lanterns. A woman had died, but more than that, a mystery had begun to breathe, slowly, heavily, as though matching the rhythm of his own heart. He tamped the tobacco with his thumb, lit again, and inhaled deeply. The fog swirled around him, clinging to his hat, his coat, his face, as if refusing to let him go. It was only later, when he sat at his desk with the first report spread before him, that he noticed how little there was. No witnesses, no clear cause. A name scribbled from the identification in her handbag. Anne-Marie Lescar, 38 years old, resident of a boarding house on Rue de Turenne. Occupation, unclear. No family immediately recorded. A solitary figure. And yet, that smile, no paper could explain it. No report could carry the sensation of standing before it. That belonged to him alone. He leaned back in his chair, pipe balanced on the ashtray, smoke rising in the slant of morning light. Around him the office bustled with small noises, footsteps, murmurs, the scratching of pens. But Maigret was elsewhere, in the square, in the fog, in the faint whisper of a woman's lips, curving at the moment of silence. He knew the case was already tightening its grip, binding him not with urgency, but with inevitability. By noon, Paris was awake in full, but for Maigret the day remained caught between the shuttered silence of dawn and the weight of a body lifted into a cart. The city was alive, but he walked as though in a dream, heavy coat hanging from his shoulders, pipe ever at his mouth, the fog never entirely gone. He felt, as he often did at the beginning of such cases, less like a man chasing facts than like one listening for the rhythm beneath them, waiting for the city itself to confess. And somewhere in that rhythm, hidden in fog and silence, lay the reason a woman had smiled at her own murder scene. By late afternoon, the fog had thinned, though it lingered in patches, curling at the mouths of alleys and rising like faint steam from the river. The square where the woman had been found had already absorbed the intrusion, as Paris always did. By then, only a faint darkening on the stone, and a curious silence marked the spot, and passers-by quickened their steps without glancing too closely. Yet Maigret had not let the image go, and as he left the Quai des Orfèvres with Janvier at his side, his pipe clamped in his teeth, his mind circled back to the details. Her shoes, her gloves, the faint smell of violets. He chose to begin with the nearest café, the one on the corner, opposite the fountain. It was not a grand establishment, but one of those small Parisian cafés that survive more on habit than on distinction. Its awning sagged slightly, stained by rain, and inside the smoke from cheap tobacco thickened the air until the lamps glowed with a dull yellow halo. The tiled floor was worn, the wooden tables scarred, and the mirrors behind the zinc counter clouded by years of neglect. A half-dozen men sat scattered at the tables, nursing glasses of wine or beer, their eyes half on the street and half on one another. As Maigret entered, the murmur of voices dipped as if a cold draught had passed through the room. He did not hurry to dispel it. He hung his coat on a hook by the door, shook the damp from his hat, and advanced heavily to the counter, where the proprietor, a thin man with a drooping moustache, stood polishing a glass. The inspector ordered a calvados, his voice steady, his expression unreadable, then settled himself at a table in the corner where he could see the entire room. Janvier followed, sitting beside him, notebook ready but unused. They drank in silence at first. Maigret had learned long ago that words come only when silence has pressed against them long enough. The patrons fidgeted, glanced towards him, then away. At one table, two men bent their heads together, whispering, their hands restless against their glasses. At another, a woman in a dark shawl stirred her coffee, absently, her eyes on the street. Behind the counter, the proprietor continued polishing his glass, his movements too deliberate, too precise. Finally, Maigret spoke, his voice low, but carrying. "You knew her," he said, without naming the woman. The words hung in the smoke. The proprietor stiffened, his moustache twitching. A cough came from one of the tables. but no one answered. Maigret drew on his pipe, exhaled slowly, then leaned back in his chair. His eyes travelled from face to face, not accusing, merely observing. At last, the woman in the shawl shifted uneasily. "She came sometimes," she said softly. "Not often. She sat by the window. She never stayed long." "What did she drink?" Maigret asked. The woman hesitated. "Wine sometimes. White wine. Small glass." He nodded, saying nothing more. The silence resumed, but it was a different silence now, strained, as if each person waited for another to speak. It was one of the men at the far table who finally broke it. He was heavy-set, with red hands and the face of a labourer. "She wasn't from here," he muttered. "Not really. We noticed her because she wasn't like the others. Quiet. Always with that little smile. Didn't belong." Maigret's eyes narrowed slightly. "Smile?" The man shifted, uncomfortable. Not laughing, not friendly, just as if she had a secret, as if she knew something we didn't. He drained his glass, thumped it on the table, and avoided Maigret's gaze. The inspector allowed the room to breathe again, his heavy presence filling the silence. He sipped his Calvados, watching the proprietor, who still had not spoken. At last Maigret rose, approached the counter, and set his glass down with a soft thud. "Monsieur," he said, "you served her." The proprietor swallowed. His moustache quivered. "Yes, Inspector. She came perhaps once a week, always alone, never with a man. She asked for wine, always the same. She sat quietly, looking out at the square. She spoke to no one." "Did she seem afraid?" The man shook his head quickly. "No, calm. Too calm, perhaps." "Did she ever meet anyone here?" The proprietor hesitated, then nodded slightly. "Once. A man in a dark coat. He sat with her for 10 minutes. They spoke quietly. I couldn't hear. Then he left." She remained another hour, staring at the square. Maigret's eyes narrowed. "Describe him." The proprietor frowned, struggling to recall. Medium height, hat pulled low, ordinary face. I thought perhaps a clerk, or a minor official, nothing remarkable. "Would you recognize him again?" The man hesitated, then shook his head. "Perhaps. But I am not sure." Maigret tamped the ashes in his pipe, his expression unreadable. He turned, scanning the cafe once more. The woman in the shawl avoided his eyes, stirring her coffee endlessly. The labourer stared at the floor. The other patrons shifted uneasily. They had all seen her, this solitary woman, with her faint smile, and none of them had understood her. Now they were being asked to remember what they had never noticed. He left a coin on the counter, heavy enough to signal the end of his questions, then turned to leave. Janvier followed, glancing back at the faces that quickly relaxed once the inspector's bulk filled the doorway. Outside, the fog had lifted slightly and the street was alive with the hum of evening traffic. They walked in silence for several steps before Janvier spoke. "Do you believe them?" Maigret grunted. "They told me what they could. The rest they didn't see, or chose not to." They paused at the fountain, where the square still seemed marked by absence. Maigret drew deeply on his pipe, the smoke curling upward. "She was known here, but only as a shadow. No one asked who she was, no one wanted to know. That's Paris, Janvier, a city of neighbours who remain strangers." Janvier nodded, scribbling a note at last. But Maigret was no longer watching him. His eyes rested on the damp stones, the shuttered windows, the faint glow of the cafe behind them. He was listening, as he always did, for the undercurrent beneath the words, the unspoken truths that lingered in silence. And in that silence he thought he heard something, not a sound, but a memory. The faint echo of a woman's smile in a smoky cafe, a secret carried quietly into the fog. The investigation would move forward step by step, but for Maigret the case was already beginning to take shape. The smile was no accident. It was a message, a clue hidden in serenity. And somewhere among the cafe's shadows, in whispers and glances, lay the first thread that would unravel it. He pulled his coat tighter, pipe glowing in the dusk, and turned toward Rue de Turenne. There, in a narrow boarding house with peeling paint and worn steps, awaited the next trace of the woman who smiled. The boarding house on Rue de Turenne did not stand out among its neighbours. It was one of those tall, narrow buildings whose facade bore the patina of decades, plaster flaking from the corners, iron balconies rusted to a dull brown, shutters perpetually in need of paint. Its entrance was a wooden door with a cracked pane and a bell that jangled weakly when Maigret pushed it open. The smell inside was unmistakable. Cabbage boiled too long, dust caught in carpets, the faint tang of soap that could not quite cleanse the weight of years. A woman appeared almost immediately, bustling from a back room, wiping her hands on her apron. She was small, sharp-faced, with the alert expression of someone who had long ago learned to watch everything and reveal nothing. "Inspector Maigret?" she said, her voice pitched between deference and suspicion. News travelled quickly. The police had already been by with questions. But this was different. This was Maigret himself. He inclined his head gravely, pipe between his teeth, eyes heavy-lidded but attentive. "Madame Girard, is it?" She nodded. "Yes, I keep the house. You've come about Mademoiselle Lescaut." Her tone softened on the name, almost imperceptibly. "A quiet tenant, Inspector, paid regularly, never caused a fuss." Maigret allowed himself a faint grunt, following her up the narrow staircase, his heavy body moving with surprising care on the creaking steps. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper, once floral, now reduced to pale outlines where colour had long ago surrendered. The smell of cabbage lingered, mixing with dust. Somewhere above, a door closed softly, footsteps retreating. Other tenants, curious but cautious, already aware of tragedy. They reached the second floor. Madame Girard gestured to a door at the end of the corridor. "Her room," she said, and produced a key from her apron pocket. She unlocked it and stepped aside, leaving the way clear for Maigret. He entered slowly. The room was small, furnished with the bare necessities, a bed neatly made with a faded quilt, a table under the window, a wardrobe with a cracked mirror, a chair worn smooth by use. Yet despite its austerity there was a kind of order, almost elegance, to the space. The curtains were clean, the bed crisply arranged, the few objects on the table aligned with care. He stood in the centre of the room, drawing on his pipe, letting the air settle around him. It smelled faintly of violets, the same perfume he had detected at the square. On the table lay a book, its pages marked by a ribbon, and beside it a small glass bottle half filled with water, in which a single wilted carnation leaned wearily. The wardrobe door stood slightly ajar, revealing neatly folded blouses, a skirt, and a hat box. Janvier lingered by the door, notebook in hand, waiting for Maigret's observations. But the inspector said nothing. He walked slowly to the window, where the glass was blurred by condensation, and looked out at the street below. Carriages passed, children shouted faintly, a bicycle bell rang. Normal life moved on, indifferent to the solitary life that had ended here. He turned back, his eyes scanning the details. On the mantel, a small clock ticked softly. Next to it, a photograph in a cheap frame, a younger Anne-Marie Lescaut, seated stiffly in a studio chair, her eyes fixed somewhere beyond the camera, her smile already elusive. She wore a plain dress, her hair drawn back, her hands folded in her lap. No family beside her, no friends, only herself. Madame Girard hovered in the corridor, clearly torn between curiosity and propriety. At last Maigret beckoned her inside. "Did she have visitors?" he asked, his voice quiet, almost conversational. "Not often," the woman said, wringing her hands. "She kept to herself. Sometimes a man, once every month or two, never the same one twice, I think. They came in the evening, left before night. She never seemed compromised. She was discreet." "Did she talk to you?" Madame Girard shook her head. "Polite greetings, nothing more. She paid her rent on time, always in cash. She worked, I assume, though she never said where. Sometimes she returned late, but not drunk, not disorderly. I thought her respectable enough." Respectable enough. Maigret's gaze returned to the room. Respectable, yes, but lonely. Everything here suggested a life lived with care, but without intimacy. The book, the flower, the photograph, tokens of solitude more than of company. And yet the smile at the fountain haunted him. It was not the smile of a woman who lived in silence. It was the smile of someone who had found, at the last moment, a kind of recognition. He crouched before the wardrobe, running his thick fingers over the folded clothes. Each was worn but clean, mended where necessary. No extravagance, no vanity. In the hat box he found a simple felt hat, modestly trimmed. At the bottom of the wardrobe a suitcase rested, its leather cracked with age. Inside were letters tied with a ribbon. He untied them carefully, spreading them on the bed. The letters were from a provincial town, written in a neat but faded hand. Most were unsigned, addressed only with endearments. "My dear Anne-Marie, my dearest one." They spoke of longing, of promises never fulfilled, of an affection that dwindled into silence. The last letter was dated nearly a year ago. After that, nothing. Maigret read them slowly, pipe smoke curling from his lips. The words were tender, but hesitant, the kind of affection that never dared to manifest fully. He replaced them in the suitcase, retied the ribbon, and closed the lid. A year of silence. And then the smile. He rose heavily, turning back to Madame Girard. "Did she ever mention family?" The landlady shook her head. "None, at least none that I heard of. She received no visitors who claimed relation, no parcels, no telegrams." "And money? Did she live comfortably?" "She was careful," Madame Girard replied. "Not poor, but never extravagant. Enough for rent, for food, for her small pleasures. Always in cash, always on time." Maigret nodded. He felt the weight of the room pressing against him, the silence, the perfume, the letters tied with ribbon. It was not only a room, it was a portrait, a woman's life in fragments arranged with modest care, awaiting a conclusion she seemed to have anticipated. He stepped to the table, lifted the book. It was a collection of poems, pages worn from use, lines underlined faintly in pencil, words about solitude, about memory, about the quiet dignity of resignation. He closed it gently, placed it back. When he left the room, he paused on the threshold, turning once more to look. The bed neat, the clock ticking, the photograph gazing eternally beyond the camera. He felt as though she was still here, watching him, her faint smile lingering. He replaced his hat, heavy footsteps echoing down the corridor, leaving the landlady wringing her hands. Outside the street had grown busier, the late afternoon light dimming. Maigret paused on the steps, pipe smoke curling around him, Janvier at his side. "A life lived quietly," he murmured. "Too quietly, until the end." Janvier glanced at him. "What do you make of it, Chief?" Maigret shook his head. I make nothing yet. Only impressions. But impressions weigh more than facts at the beginning. And this one, he drew deeply on his pipe. This one carries the weight of a woman who smiled at her own death. They walked slowly back toward the car, their breath steaming in the cool air. The city pulsed around them, indifferent, unknowing. But Maigret carried with him the silence of a small room on Rue de Turenne, the letters tied with ribbon, and the faint perfume of violets lingering in the air. The morgue stood at the edge of the Ile de la Cité, a place Maigret knew too well, though he never grew used to it. It was late evening when he entered, the lamps along the Seine flickering in the damp, their reflections wavering in the black water. The fog had lifted, leaving a chill clarity that made the city's outlines sharper, more merciless. Paris breathed heavily in the night, but here, at the morgue, silence pressed against the stone walls like a second skin. Inside, the air was cold, scrubbed with disinfectant, carrying the faint, metallic odor of stillness. The attendant recognized him, nodded without surprise, and led him through corridors where shadows lengthened across tiled floors. Maigret's steps echoed, slow and measured, his broad shoulders hunched slightly under his heavy coat. He carried his pipe in one hand, unlit, out of respect for the place. When they reached the room, the attendant pulled back the sheet with practiced indifference. There she was again, Anne-Marie Lescaut. The same face, the same plain features, but now stripped of the atmosphere of the square. Under this harsh white light she looked more ordinary, her skin waxen, her eyes closed in eternal refusal. And yet the smile remained. It was faint, subtle, but unmistakable. A curve at the corners of her lips like the aftertaste of some private recognition. Maigret stood over her, his massive frame casting a shadow across her face. He did not speak. He simply watched, as though by sheer force of patience he might compel her to disclose the secret she had carried. Janvier stood a little back, shifting uneasily. He had never liked the morgue, and the silence here pressed heavily on him. But Maigret was immovable, as if rooted to the tiled floor. He leaned closer, studying her features. There were no signs of pain, no contortions of agony. Whatever had taken her had left her in calm. He remembered the testimony from the cafe, the labourer who spoke of her secret smile, the proprietor's description of the man in the dark coat. She had been a woman of solitude, yet not entirely untouched by life. She had received letters, she had known encounters, she had carried secrets. And now, in death, she seemed almost to affirm them. "Natural causes?" Janvier asked finally, his voice hushed. Maigret shook his head slowly. "Perhaps, but not natural in the way you mean. There is nothing of accident here, nothing of surprise." He drew in a breath, heavy, deliberate, and let it out through his nose. His mind turned back to the room on Rue de Turenne, the carefully folded clothes, the wilted carnation in the glass. All these details formed a picture, but it was incomplete. The smile belonged to something beyond them, something not yet visible. He beckoned the attendant closer. "What does the report say?" The man shrugged slightly. "Cause of death not clear. No obvious wounds, no bruises. No trace of violence. Heart failure, perhaps. Poison, possibly, but no certainty yet. Tests will be made. Poison." The word lingered in the cold air like smoke. Maigret did not react outwardly, but his mind tightened around the possibility. A woman alone, living quietly, found dead at dawn with a smile on her lips. Poison would explain the calm, the absence of struggle, but not the smile. He looked again, long and hard. He tried to imagine her final moments, walking through the fog, pausing at the fountain, her hand on the cold stone, the weight settling over her. And then acceptance, not fear, not rage, acceptance accompanied by that faint smile, as though she had recognized someone or something, as though death itself had been an old acquaintance. Maigret straightened at last, his coat heavy on his shoulders. He tamped the bowl of his pipe absently with his thumb, though he did not light it. "We must learn more about her," he said quietly. "Her past, her acquaintances. She did not arrive at this square by chance." Janvier nodded, scribbling in his notebook, though his eyes flicked uneasily to the body once more. He had seen many corpses in his time, but none that lingered quite like this one. It was not horror that unsettled him. It was the strange serenity, the quiet dignity of that smile. As they left, the door closed softly behind them, sealing the woman once again in silence. Outside, the night air struck them with its damp chill. The Seine rolled dark beneath the bridges, carrying with it the secrets of the city. Maigret lit his pipe at last, the flame briefly illuminating his face, and exhaled a long plume of smoke. They walked along the quay, the inspector's boots striking heavily against the stones. "Poison," he murmured. "Or something like it. A deliberate act, not chance." "Suicide?" Janvier ventured. Maigret shook his head. "Perhaps, but then why in the square? Why in public, at dawn, with a smile? No. If it was suicide, it was not ordinary. It was meant to be seen. It was meant to say something." They crossed a bridge, the lamps casting long shadows. The city moved quietly around them, carriages rattling in the distance, footsteps echoing from alleyways. Maigret walked slowly, puffing at his pipe, his brow furrowed. He thought of Madame Girard at the boarding-house, wringing her hands, insisting on her tenant's respectability. He thought of the letters tied with ribbon, the unfinished story of affection that had faded into silence. And he thought of the man in the dark coat at the café, sitting for 10 minutes and leaving no trace. Everywhere, fragments, nowhere, coherence. Yet the smile held them together, as if it were the key to a puzzle still hidden. At Quai des Orfèvres, the building loomed dark and solid against the night. Inside, the familiar bustle awaited, reports, telephones, the murmur of voices. But for Maigret, the case was no longer just a file. It was a presence, a weight that pressed on him even as he climbed the steps. He settled into his chair, the desk lamp casting a pool of yellow light. He opened the file, spread the notes before him. Anne-Marie Lescaut, 38, solitary, boarding-house resident, occasional visitor to the café, no known family, no consistent companions. A handful of letters from a provincial town, a smile in death. He puffed his pipe, eyes half closed, listening not to the words on the paper, but to the silence between them. He had learned long ago that silence often told more than facts. And in this silence he heard the faint echo of a woman's resignation, the whisper of a life lived on the margins, the sudden clarity of an ending embraced rather than resisted. The city outside hummed on, indifferent. But for Maigret the case was alive, breathing in the shadows of the Quai des Orfèvres, whispering in the smoke of his pipe. He knew the investigation would spread wider, through streets, through stations, through whispers in cafes. But tonight it remained here, condensed into the memory of a smile that would not fade. And so he sat late into the night, alone in his office, the smoke curling upward, his heavy features immovable, waiting for the first loose thread that would allow him to unravel the mystery of the woman who smiled at her own murder scene. Morning came grey and damp, the kind of Paris morning where the drizzle seemed to seep into one's very bones. At the Quai des Orfèvres, the clerks were already shuffling papers, typewriters clattering faintly in adjoining rooms, telephones ringing with the dull persistence of bureaucratic life. Maigret sat at his desk, pipe stem clenched in his teeth, the smell of tobacco weaving through the stale air. Before him lay a small pile of documents, the preliminary morgue report, Janvier's notes from the café, and a handful of letters retrieved from Anne-Marie Lesca's suitcase. The report remained inconclusive. No marks of violence. Heart failure suspected. Toxicology pending. The words were clinical, insufficient. They stripped the mystery of its atmosphere, reduced a woman's smile to a line in an official document. Maigret pushed the paper aside with a grunt of irritation. Instead, he reached for the letters. He had read them the night before, slowly, the words lingering in his mind as he smoked in silence. They were provincial in tone, stiff, restrained, written by someone unused to expressing tenderness on paper. They spoke of longing and absence, of a woman missed but never claimed. Les postmarks were from a small town in Burgundy, near Auxerre. One letter contained a fragment of a telegram pasted inside, as if the sender had wished to preserve it. "Arriving Saturday. Stop, Hope. To see you stop yours ever." It was dated nearly a year ago. A journey planned, perhaps undertaken, perhaps abandoned. After that, silence. Maigret leaned back in his chair, blowing a slow cloud of smoke toward the ceiling. The rhythm of the letters suggested a relationship that had faltered either by choice or necessity. He wondered if the man in the café, the one described by the proprietor, had been the same correspondent. If so, what had passed between them in those whispered 10 minutes? He rose, heavy and deliberate, and crossed the office to the map pinned on the wall. His thick finger traced the route from Paris to Burgundy, following the railway line southeast. Provincial towns, small stations, anonymous inns, 1,000 places where a life might pause or resume. He thought of Anne-Marie leaving her narrow room, carrying her modest suitcase, stepping onto a provincial platform where no one noticed her arrival. Janvier entered, hat in hand, his notebook already open. "Chief, telegram records have come in." He placed a folder on the desk. Maigret opened it, scanning the lists of outgoing and incoming messages from the Rue de Turenne post office. Several telegrams bore Anne-Marie's name. Short, precise, all addressed to the same town in Burgundy. The earliest dated back 2 years, the latest nearly a year ago. After that, nothing. He puffed at his pipe, his eyes narrowing. The silence after the last telegram gnawed at him. It suggested an ending, not necessarily of affection, but of possibility. Something had broken then. Yet the woman had continued her life in Paris, quietly, methodically, until the morning when she was found at the fountain, smiling at her own death. "Janvier," Maigret said slowly, "we will need to trace that address. Someone there knows who she was to them. Order a car for this afternoon." Janvier nodded, scribbling, then hesitated. "And the man in the café?" Maigret grunted. "He waits. For now, Burgundy may speak louder than Paris." They left later that day, the inspector's bulk filling the rear seat of the police car, pipe clamped between his teeth, eyes fixed on the grey horizon. The countryside unrolled in damp fields, bare trees dripping in the mist, villages clustered around church steeples. The rhythm of the wheels on the rails of thought carried him back through years of provincial cases, the smell of kerosene lamps in small-town inns, the wary stares of villagers when the police arrived from Paris. He knew this world well. Its silences were thicker than those of the city, its secrets more jealously guarded. They reached the town near dusk. The station was nearly deserted, a single porter leaning on his trolley, the smell of coal lingering from a recent train. Maigret descended heavily, buttoning his coat against the wind. He paused, listening. The sound of footsteps echoed on the platform, a solitary traveller hurrying away. The inspector's eyes followed the sound, watching the way the figure merged into the narrow street beyond. At the post office, a young clerk confirmed the address. The telegrams had been sent to a Monsieur Pierre Darzac, residing in a modest house at the edge of town. The name meant nothing to Maigret, but the weight of routine gave it significance. A man who had once received Anne-Marie's words, who had once promised journeys. The house was small, 2 stories, shutters closed tight against the damp evening. A lamp burned faintly in an upstairs window. Maigret knocked with the patience of someone who knows doors open more readily when not forced. At last a man answered, thin, pale, with eyes that darted nervously even in stillness. "Darzac?" Maigret asked, his voice quiet but firm. "Yes, and you are?" "Inspector Maigret from Paris." He held the man's gaze, letting the name settle between them like a weight. "We are here about Anne-Marie Lescar." The man flinched, barely perceptible, but enough. He stepped aside reluctantly, gesturing them into a sitting room sparsely furnished, its air smelling faintly of dust and tobacco. A photograph of a younger Darzac with a woman and child stood on the mantel. Family, then? A complication? Darzac sat stiffly, his hands clasped, his gaze fixed on the floor. "She is dead, then?" he said finally. Not a question, a statement. "Yes," Maigret replied. "Found in Paris yesterday morning, alone, at a fountain." The man closed his eyes briefly, then opened them with a weary sigh. "I thought as much. I knew it would come to this." Maigret watched him silently, pipe unlit, his bulk pressing into the chair like an immovable presence. He waited, as he always did, for silence to loosen the tongue. Darzac shifted uneasily. "We were close once. Years ago, she came from here, you know. Not this town, but near enough. We met by chance. I was alone then before I remarried. We corresponded after she moved to Paris. She came here sometimes, discreetly. But it could not last. I had obligations, a family." He gestured vaguely toward the mantel. "And the letters?" Maigret asked. Darzac nodded. "Yes, mine, foolish words, promises I could not keep. She wanted more than I could give. The last time she came, we quarrelled. After that, silence. Did you see her in Paris recently?" Darzac's eyes flickered. "Once. Months ago, she asked to meet, at a cafe near her room. 10 minutes, no more. She said she understood. She said she would not trouble me again." Maigret's gaze deepened, heavy and penetrating. "And you believed her?" Darzac hesitated. "I wanted to. For my own sake, yes. But there was something in her eyes, as if she knew an end was coming. She smiled, even then. It unsettled me." The room grew quiet, the ticking of a clock filling the silence. Maigret puffed at his empty pipe, watching the man's nervous hands. He felt the case tightening, threads converging, the letters, the cafe, the smile. When they left, night had fallen, the narrow streets glistening under the lamplight. The station loomed ahead, its platform nearly deserted once more. Maigret paused, listening again to the echo of footsteps on stone. They reminded him of the woman herself, measured, solitary, fading into fog. As the train carried them back toward Paris, the inspector sat motionless, pipe unlit, his thoughts circling heavily. Darzac's confession explained much, but not the smile. That remained. A faint curve of lips, a secret known only to her. And in that secret, Maigret sensed, lay the heart of the case. The train rattled back into Paris under a sky that had turned from iron grey to velvet black, lamps glowing in hazy circles along the boulevards. Maigret, heavy with thought, descended at the Gare de Lyon and allowed the car to take him directly home rather than to the Quai des Orfèvres. He knew the file could wait until morning. What he carried in his mind could not be left behind at any desk. On Boulevard Richard-Lenoir, the familiar door opened at his knock. Madame Maigret appeared, smiling faintly, her apron dusted with flour, the warmth of their modest flat enveloping him. The smells of dinner clung to the air, stew simmering gently, onions softened in butter, the faint sweetness of an apple tart cooling on the sideboard. He hung his heavy coat on the rack, slipped his pipe into his pocket, and kissed her cheek with quiet affection. Dinner was ready, the table neatly set as always. He lowered himself into his chair, the wooden one that had carried his bulk through countless evenings, and let the warmth of home surround him. Madame Maigret ladled stew into his bowl without a word at first, her calm presence allowing him the silence he needed. They had lived too long together for unnecessary questions. She knew his silences were not emptiness but preparation. It was only after he had eaten several mouthfuls, after the hunger of the day's travel had been dulled, that she spoke. "A case?" she asked softly. "Yes," he said, his voice deep, steady. "A woman found near the Seine, alone, smiling." Madame Maigret's hands paused on the bread she was slicing. "Smiling?" He nodded. "Strange, isn't it? She lived quietly, almost invisibly. A boarding house, few visitors, no family. Yet she died as if she had recognized something or someone." His wife placed the bread on the plate, sat across from him, and folded her hands. She was not a woman of speculation, nor of dramatic opinions, but she listened in a way that invited him to arrange his thoughts aloud. "She received letters," Maigret continued slowly, "from a man in Burgundy. They knew each other years ago. He married. She did not. They corresponded, met occasionally. Their last meeting was months ago in a café near her room. 10 minutes, no more. After that silence, and then she dies." Madame Maigret tilted her head slightly, her eyes calm, reflective. "Did she love him?" The inspector puffed at his unlit pipe, though the familiar gesture steadied him. "Perhaps. Enough to wait for letters, enough to smile at him when he refused her. He told me she smiled even then. The same smile she wore when she died." "Then she forgave him," Madame Maigret said simply. Maigret frowned, leaning back in his chair. "Forgave? Perhaps. But for what? He was not cruel, only weak. He offered promises, then withdrew. Many women live through such disappointments. They do not end at a fountain, smiling at their own death." His wife stirred her stew thoughtfully, then set the spoon aside. "It is not weakness that wounds most deeply, Jules. It is indifference. To be forgotten, to become invisible to the one you love, that is harder than betrayal. Perhaps her smile was not forgiveness. Perhaps it was the opposite. Perhaps it was her way of saying, 'I have the last word.'" The inspector considered this, smoke rising in his imagination, though his pipe lay dormant. It was not the kind of conclusion he would record in a report, nor one that would stand in court, but it carried weight, the quiet weight of truth spoken without pretense. They ate in silence for a while, the ticking of the kitchen clock filling the room. Outside, a cart rattled past, a dog barked faintly. The city breathed around them, indifferent to the private world at their table. When the tart was served, its crust golden and fragrant, Maigret allowed himself a small smile. He had often relied on these evenings, these quiet conversations, more than he admitted. Madame Maigret's calm was not analytical, but intuitive. She did not seek evidence. She sought meaning. "Do you think it was suicide?" he asked at last. She looked at him directly. "Do you?" He did not answer at once. He cut into the tart, the crust breaking neatly under his fork, the apple slices gleaming. He chewed slowly, his brow furrowed. If it was not ordinary. It was public, deliberate. She chose to die where she would be found, where her smile would be seen, as if it were a message, but to whom? To him, Madame Maigret said gently. To the man who forgot her. The inspector sighed, setting his fork aside. Perhaps, but it feels too theatrical for her. She was discreet, modest. The boarding-house room, the neat clothes, the quiet life. Such a woman does not seek spectacle. Madame Maigret's eyes softened. Sometimes the quietest lives hide the strongest desires. Perhaps she wished for once not to be invisible, to leave something behind that could not be ignored. Her words lingered long after the plates were cleared, long after the last glass of wine was finished. Later, when he settled into his armchair with his pipe lit at last, smoke curling lazily toward the ceiling, he felt the weight of her intuition pressing against his own thoughts. It did not provide answers, but it reshaped the questions. He sat long into the night, the faint clatter of dishes from the kitchen mixing with the muffled hum of the city outside. He thought of Anne-Marie Lescaut, sitting alone at her table with a wilted carnation, waiting for letters that no longer came. He thought of her walking through the fog at dawn, pausing at the fountain, arranging herself with care, a faint smile curving her lips. And he thought of Darzac in his provincial house, pale and nervous, insisting on obligations and family, while his eyes betrayed regret. The case was no longer only about death, it was about meaning, the meaning a solitary woman had chosen to leave behind. When at last he went to bed, Madame Maigret already slept, her breathing calm, steady. He lay beside her, staring into the darkness, the glow of his extinguished pipe still lingering in his throat. The case pressed against him like a weight, but also like a voice, insistent and unresolved. Somewhere in the silence, he thought he heard footsteps again, the faint echo of Anne-Marie Lescaut walking through fog, her smile hidden in the dark. By the following morning, the newspapers had seized upon the story. It was inevitable. A woman found dead in the fog, lips curved in a mysterious smile. It was the sort of detail that caught the imagination of reporters hungry for drama where official reports hesitated. Maigret had scarcely reached his office at the Quai des Orfèvres before the clippings began to land on his desk, some delivered by clerks, others by eager subordinates who thought the chief might be flattered to see his case on the front page. Le Matin spoke of the Lady of the Fountain, weaving an air of romantic tragedy around Anne-Marie Lescaut. Le Journal, less poetic, hinted at scandal, suggesting she had been the mistress of a wealthy man who abandoned her. L'Intransigeant went further still, insinuating poison, betrayal, perhaps even conspiracy. The smile was in every headline, twisted into symbol, legend, or mockery. Maigret read them all with a growing heaviness, not anger exactly. He had long since accepted the press as a parallel police force, operating with its own methods, shaping public opinion whether he liked it or not. But there was a danger here. Gossip hardened quickly into truth in the minds of Parisians. Soon everyone would know the story, even if none of it was fact. Janvier entered, carrying yet another paper, shaking his head. They've made her into a heroine, Chief, or a sinner. Depends on which one you read. Not a single one mentions the possibility of heart failure. Maigret grunted, tamping his pipe. Of course not. Heart failure doesn't sell copies. He spread the clippings across his desk, the bold headlines glaring up at him. Words like mystery, smile, tragic beauty leapt from the pages. He noticed, with a faint tightening of the jaw, that none of them used her real name. To the press, she was already a figure, stripped of identity. Anne-Marie Lescaut had become the smiling woman, a story rather than a life. He rose, pipe in hand, and walked slowly to the window overlooking the Seine. The water moved sluggishly beneath the bridges, barges heavy with coal pushing against the current. He thought of her room, the wilted carnation, the letters tied with ribbon. None of that appeared in the newspapers. None of it mattered to the crowds buying copies at kiosks. They would whisper about romance and poison, never about solitude and resignation. By mid-morning, a delegation of journalists appeared in person, clustering in the corridor outside his office. Their voices carried, eager, insistent. Maigret let them wait a few minutes before opening the door, filling the doorway with his bulk, pipe smoke curling around him. "Messieurs," he said quietly, "you know I cannot comment." A younger reporter, hat tilted at an angle, pushed forward. "Inspector, is it true she was poisoned?" Another chimed in. "Was she a courtesan, Chief, abandoned by a lover?" A third tried. "Was she smiling because she forgave her murderer?" Maigret held their eyes one by one, saying nothing. Silence was his armor, heavier than words. Finally he spoke, slowly. "A woman has died. She was a person, not a headline. If you have respect, write that much." He closed the door gently but firmly, leaving their questions unanswered. Back at his desk, he drew deeply on his pipe, smoke thickening the air. He knew his words would not deter them. Already kiosks were running out of copies. Already cafe patrons were debating the meaning of the smile, inventing theories over their glasses of wine. The city had claimed the case as its own, bending it into legend. By noon, the effect was visible. At the cafe near the fountain, where Maigret returned briefly, the proprietor was harried by curious strangers demanding the very table where the woman had once sat. Patrons leaned across one another, whispering speculation. Some claimed to have seen her often, though their faces betrayed invention. Others swore she had been in the company of a wealthy banker, a German, even an actor. Maigret listened without correcting them, his heavy presence enough to quiet the more outrageous stories. But he felt the truth slipping further away, smothered beneath rumor. Back at the Quai des Orfèvres, Lucas appeared with more reports. "Chief, the phones haven't stopped. Tips, claims, people swearing they knew her. Most are nonsense." He hesitated, lowering his voice. "Some say she was involved with politics, others with crime." Maigret puffed, unshaken. "They always do." But he knew the danger was not in the lies themselves, it was in their persistence. Lies had a way of attracting fragments of truth until the two became inseparable. And, in the height, noise, the quiet details, the smile, the carnation, the faded letters, risked being drowned. That evening, as he walked home through the Boulevard Saint-Michel, he saw the headlines himself, pasted on kiosks, shouted by boys. The smiling woman stared back at him from crude sketches, her image already distorted by imagination. Couples paused to buy copies, debating her identity as though she were a character in a serialized novel. He passed them heavily, pipe smoke trailing, his hat pulled low. He felt the city swallowing her. At home, Madame Maigret noticed his weariness at once. She served him dinner in silence, her eyes calm, patient. When at last he spoke, it was with a sigh. "The papers have made her theirs. They will not let her go." His wife's voice was quiet. "Then you must look where they do not. Not at what the city imagines, but at what she left behind." Her words anchored him. He realized he had been pulled into the whirlpool of rumor, distracted by the city's appetite for spectacle. He needed to return to the ground, the small, patient details that spoke more truth than 100 headlines. That night, long after the city had quieted, he sat again at his desk with the letters spread before him. He read them slowly, deliberately, blocking out the noise of speculation. The handwriting, the hesitant words, the silences between them, these were her story. Not the inventions shouted from kiosks. He tamped his pipe, exhaled smoke, and murmured aloud into the silence, as if speaking to her. "We will find it, Madame Lescaut. Beneath the rumors, we will find it." And as he leaned back in his chair, eyes half closed, he thought again of her smile, not as a legend, not as a headline, but as a message he had not yet deciphered. The rumors had made Paris restless, but Maigret knew the truth would not be found in the boulevards or in the columns of newspapers. He returned instead to the quieter thread, the provincial one. The letters in Anne-Marie Lescaut's suitcase had spoken too insistently of Burgundy to be ignored, and, though he had already confronted Pierre Darzac, there lingered the sense of unfinished business. A woman does not sustain correspondence for years without leaving echoes in her own village. There would be neighbours, acquaintances, perhaps even an innkeeper or a grocer who remembered her visits. Provincial life recorded its histories not in papers, but in glances and in gossip, shared under low beams by the fire. So Maigret set out again, this time not for Darzac's town, but for the small village mentioned obliquely in one of the older letters, a place where Anne-Marie's name had first been written by a steady hand. The train carried him south, fields unfolding beyond the window, the late autumn air, heavy with damp. He sat silently, pipe unlit, his bulk filling the seat, his mind sifting impressions the way a fisherman sifts through his nets, feeling for weight. The station where he disembarked was little more than a platform of stone and a wooden hut with a faded timetable nailed to the wall. A cart waited outside, its driver slouched against the reins, half asleep. Maigret took the road on foot instead, his steps heavy, his breath visible in the cold. He followed the narrow street into the village, where houses huddled close together, their shutters weathered, their chimneys breathing faint smoke. The smell of damp earth and wood smoke clung to the air. He began at the inn, as he often did in such places. The room smelled of wine and ash, the floorboards scarred by years of boots. A few men sat at tables, their caps pulled low, murmuring over glasses. The innkeeper, a broad-shouldered woman with a red kerchief at her neck, looked up as he entered, and her eyes sharpened with curiosity. Paris policemen were not a common sight here. Maigret ordered wine, placed his hat on the table, and waited. The silence thickened, but not for long. Villagers were not like Parisians. They did not feign ignorance as easily. They were curious, direct, and suspicious all at once. "You've come about her?" the innkeeper said finally, placing the glass before him. He looked up, his face grave. "Anne-Marie Lescaut," the woman nodded, folding her arms. "She was from here, yes, a quiet girl. Her father died young, her mother kept a shop until she passed. Anne-Marie went to Paris to work, said she'd make something of herself. But she came back now and then. Not often, but enough for people to remember." The murmur in the room grew louder. One of the men leaned forward. "She stayed here sometimes with us. Brought a man once. Thin fellow, nervous. Didn't like being seen. They kept to themselves, whispered in the corner." "Darzac?" Maigret said flatly. The man shrugged. "Maybe. We didn't ask. Folks mind their own business here, but we noticed." Another voice from the far table added, "She always looked the same, polite, calm, a little sad. But the last time, different. She smiled, not at us, not at anyone in particular. She smiled like she was carrying a secret. That word again, smile. It pursued him now through every corridor of the case, reappearing like a shadow. He drank his wine slowly, his eyes half-lidded, listening. The innkeeper spoke again. She came 2 winters ago, stayed 3 nights, sat by the fire, hardly spoke, but watched the door as if expecting someone. When she left a carnation on the table. Strange, in winter, no one knew where she had found it. Maigret felt the tug of recognition, the carnation, the same flower that had stood wilted in the glass on her table in Paris, a thread linking village and city, past and present. "Did she speak of family?" he asked. The innkeeper shook her head. "None left here, only a cousin in another town, but they hadn't spoken in years. She belonged to no one." The inspector rose, leaving coins on the table. The eyes of the men followed him, curious but cautious, as he stepped back into the damp air. He walked slowly through the village, past the church with its bell tower leaning slightly, past the grocer where women huddled with baskets, glancing at him with furtive interest. The air smelled of damp wool and churned earth. Everywhere he went, Anne-Marie's presence lingered, not loud, not dramatic, but faint, like perfume that refuses to fade. At last he reached the cemetery on the hill. Stones leaned at odd angles, names weathered to obscurity. He found the Lescat plot easily enough. Her father, her mother, dates carved without flourish, no flowers, no recent visitors. He stood there a long time, pipe in hand, the fog creeping once more along the ground. He imagined her standing here once, hat pulled low, speaking quietly to her parents in the silence. A woman who lived between 2 worlds, never fully at home in either. When he returned to Paris that night, the city felt different to him, heavier with her absence. The rumours still clattered from the press, kiosks shouting headlines, cafes buzzing with speculation. But he carried with him the silence of the village, the quiet testimony of those who had known her in her youth. She was not merely the smiling woman of the papers. She had been Anne-Marie, daughter of a shopkeeper, a girl who left for Paris with hope in her suitcase and who returned at intervals like a shadow, visiting old stones. Back at the Quai des Orfèvres, Maigret sat in his chair, fatigue pressing on him. He laid out the facts, the café in Paris, the boarding house, the letters, Darzac, the provincial visits, the carnation. Each detail was small, modest, almost trivial, and yet together they formed a pattern he could not yet see. He puffed at his pipe, eyes closed, listening inwardly as he always did. It was not evidence that troubled him now, but meaning. She had died with a smile, and everything he had learned suggested that smile had been no accident. It had roots, in the letters, in the visits, in the silence of her life. Somewhere in that chain lay the answer. He thought of the innkeeper's words. She smiled like she was carrying a secret, and he wondered, with a weight that pressed deeper than any report, whether death had been her way of revealing it or concealing it forever. The case had shifted in tone. In the beginning there had been the shock of the scene itself, the fountain in fog, the smile that unsettled even hardened policemen. Then came the routines, the room on Rue de Turenne, the letters from Burgundy, the interrogation of Darzac. Now, after the journey to her village, Maigret felt the investigation passing into another phase, one where facts grew scarce but impressions thickened. It was like entering a house where every room was familiar, yet each door opened onto silence. Back at the Quai des Orfèvres, he had the letters spread again on his desk, their faded ink, like whispers of a relationship that had promised more than it ever delivered. He read them slowly, pipe smoke curling around him, not for information, but for tone. There was yearning in them, and also hesitation, the awkward tenderness of a man unwilling to choose. The letters revealed Darzac's weakness more than Anne-Marie's devotion. Yet she had kept them, tied neatly with ribbon, as if preserving not the words, but the silence that followed them. In the afternoon, Maigret summoned Darzac once more to Paris. The man arrived pale, nervous, hat in hand. He looked smaller than before, diminished by distance from his provincial refuge. The inspector received him heavily, pipe between his teeth, eyes half-closed but piercing. "Darzac," he said quietly. "She died with a smile." The man flinched, his gaze falling to the floor. "I told you, I saw it once before. She smiled when she told me we would not meet again." "But what did it mean?" Maigret pressed, leaning forward, his bulk a weight across the table. Was it forgiveness, resignation, accusation? Darzac shook his head helplessly. "I don't know. She never explained. She never needed to. It was as if she spoke without words." The inspector studied him a long time, then dismissed him with a wave. Darzac shuffled out, leaving Maigret alone with the silence that followed. The man's testimony had added nothing, and yet it lingered. She had smiled not only in death, but in life, once before, when she severed her last tie. A confession, without words. That evening, Maigret returned to the café. He sat at her table, the one by the window, ordered a glass of white wine, and let the room fold around him. Smoke curled from the pipes and cigarettes of other patrons, voices rose and fell in low murmur. He imagined her sitting here, gloves neatly folded, eyes fixed on the square. The faintest smile at her lips, not directed at anyone, but at some thought she carried. A private smile, like a letter, never sent. The proprietor hovered, uneasy, under the inspector's presence. Finally, he ventured, "Chief, people talk too much. They invent. But she was quiet. That's the truth of it." Maigret looked up. "Quiet, yes. But what does quiet hide?" The man spread his hands helplessly, retreating. The inspector sat long after his glass was empty, his pipe smoke clouding the mirror behind the counter. He waited for silence to reveal what words could not. Later, in his office, Lucas brought him fresh reports. "Chief, the toxicology came back, traces of digitalis, strong enough to stop the heart." Poison, then, not accident, not natural failure. Digitalis, easily obtained, especially by someone familiar with medicines. Suicide, most likely. Yet Maigret did not feel relief at the clarity. Instead, he felt the weight of mystery deepen. Poison alone did not explain the smile. He imagined her in her room, pouring the substance into her glass of wine or swallowing a powder, then walking deliberately to the fountain, choosing the square as her stage. It was too deliberate, too composed. She had arranged her death as one arranges a letter, sealed with a smile instead of ink. The inspector sat heavily in his chair, his brow furrowed. Suicide was the simplest answer, and yet it was incomplete. A suicide usually carried traces of despair, letters, gestures, evidence of rage or sorrow. But Anne-Marie Lescaut had left nothing except serenity. Her room was tidy, her letters carefully stored, her final act performed with calm precision. It was less a cry for help than a confession without words. That night he walked home slowly, the city pressing around him with its evening noise. At Boulevard Richard Lenoir, Madame Maigret waited with her calm presence, dinner steaming gently on the table. Over their meal he spoke of the poison, of the deliberate nature of it, of the silence she had left behind. Madame Maigret listened without interruption. When he finished, she said softly, "Then she chose her ending, but not out of despair, out of certainty." Maigret frowned. Certainty of what? His wife folded her hands. that she had said enough without speaking, that her smile would be remembered longer than any letter. The inspector smoked late into the night, her words echoing in him. He thought of the letters tied with ribbon, of the carnation on her table, of the smile that had followed her into death. Perhaps her entire life had been a preparation for this quiet message. A life of silence culminating in one gesture that spoke louder than words. At the Quai des Orfèvres the following morning, he dictated notes, but felt no closer to conclusion. The file was filling, but not the understanding. His men looked to him for orders, but all he could say was, "Wait, listen, the city will speak." And he knew it would. Cases did not always resolve themselves in courtrooms or with confessions shouted under interrogation. Sometimes they ended in silence, in gestures half understood, in confessions without words. He returned once more to the morgue, stood again over her, studied the curve of her lips. He imagined her walking through fog, the sound of her footsteps fading, carrying with her the certainty of her last act. It was as if she had told him something without speaking, and he was still listening, straining to catch the words. As he left, the cold air of the Seine brushed against him, and he realized he was carrying not only a case, but a message, one that belonged not to the courts, but to the human heart. A woman had chosen her ending, and in doing so had left behind a smile that unsettled the living more than any crime. And Maigret, heavy, implacable, carrying his pipe and his silence, knew the case was moving toward its conclusion, not in revelation, but in understanding. The days that followed brought no sudden revelations, no anonymous tip that unraveled the mystery, no confession wrung from some desperate suspect. Instead, the case settled into Maigret's mind with the heaviness of a stone sunk to the bottom of the Seine. Reports piled up, witnesses were re-questioned, but nothing altered the essential truth already resting before him. The toxicology confirmed it beyond doubt. Anne-Marie Lescaut had died by poison, and she had taken it herself. At the Quai des Orfèvres, the file grew thicker with routine papers, statements from Madame Girard at the boarding house, from the café proprietor, from Pierre Darzac, all neatly typed and stamped. But to Maigret they felt like scaffolding around an empty building. The essence of the case was not in the documents, but in the atmosphere they only hinted at. The quiet room, the carnation, the faint perfume of violets, and above all, the smile. One afternoon, Lucas entered with a summary. "Chief, we've exhausted the trail. No evidence of foul play. No money troubles, no debts. Neighbors say she lived quietly. It's suicide. Plain enough." Maigret nodded slowly, tamping his pipe. "Yes, Lucas, plain enough. And yet—" He did not finish. He never liked to explain the weight of impressions that could not be entered into evidence. That evening he did not return directly home. Instead, he walked the streets, letting the city wash over him, the rhythm of Paris at dusk pressing against his broad frame. He passed kiosks still selling the story, though now already fading from the headlines. The smiling woman was being replaced by fresher scandals, newer tragedies. Soon she would be forgotten by the city that had devoured her. Only he carried her still, heavy in his chest. He found himself drawn again to the square, now cleansed of its mystery by the routine of days. Children played there in the afternoons, their shouts echoing against the stones. By night, lovers lingered under the lamps. The fountain trickled indifferently as if nothing had ever happened. But Maigret stood there, pipe smoke drifting, and he saw again the faint curve of her lips as she rested against the stone. He stayed a long time, letting the silence speak. The following Sunday, after a quiet lunch, Madame Maigret persuaded him to walk with her to the Luxembourg Gardens. The air was brisk, The trees stripped bare, the gravel paths scattered with fallen leaves. Couples strolled, children sailed boats in the basin, students sat with their books open but unread. The inspector walked heavily, hands deep in his pockets, pipe clamped in his teeth, but his wife's presence softened him. At a bench, they sat together. She looked at him calmly, her expression knowing. "You are still thinking of her?" she said. He nodded. "Yes." "She has told you everything she wished to," Madame Maigret said. He looked at her sharply, but her tone was matter of fact. She folded her hands, her gaze on the children running. "You men look for words, for explanations. But some things are said without them. A smile can speak more than pages of reports." Perhaps that was her confession, her legacy. To smile so that you would remember her not as forgotten, but as someone who chose her own ending. He puffed his pipe, watching the smoke drift. It was a thought he had carried himself, but hearing it spoken aloud gave it weight. Yes, Anne-Marie had not left a letter, no last words scrawled in haste. She had left only a gesture, a faint curve of lips, her head resting against the fountain as though greeting an old companion. She had taken possession of her death, shaping it as she could not shape her life. For Maigret, the case closed itself not with a revelation, but with this recognition. He returned to his office the next day, signed the necessary documents, and ordered the file archived. "Suicide," the report read. "Female, age 38. Death by digitalis." Case closed. The clerk who filed it away did not glance twice at the name. And yet, Maigret carried her still. He thought of her when he passed women in cafes sitting alone, when he saw carnations wilting in a vase, when he walked through fog at dawn. She became part of his inner gallery of faces, the quiet gallery of cases that never left him, not because of complexity, but because of their human weight. Weeks later, when Janvier mentioned her name in passing, Maigret said only, "Yes, the one who smiled." Nothing more. He did not need to. Life at the Quai des Orfèvres resumed its rhythm. New cases arrived, new corpses, new files to fill. The newspapers turned their attention elsewhere. The city continued to breathe, indifferent as always. But in one corner of Paris, near a fountain few people noticed, a woman had left her mark, faint but indelible. One night, much later, Maigret walked there alone. The square was quiet, the fountain trickling, the lamps buzzing faintly in the damp. He stood with his hands in his pockets, pipe smoke drifting upward. He imagined her standing beside him, not in flesh but in presence, her lips curved faintly. He felt no triumph, no failure, only understanding. It was not the kind of case that would be remembered in reports or discussed in cafes. It had left no grand scandal, no courtroom drama. It had ended as quietly as it had begun. But for Maigret it remained one of the truest cases of all, because it revealed nothing but humanity, solitude, resignation, the need to be seen, if only once, even in death. He turned, his coat heavy on his shoulders, and walked away slowly, the sound of his footsteps echoing across the cobblestones. Behind him, the fountain trickled on, indifferent. But he carried her with him as he always would, the woman who smiled at her own murder scene.